Welcome to our many visitors here today. You have filled in the position of those of us who are absent this weekend due to illness or travel, so we welcome you to our humble church here atop the mountains. We are going through the book of Deuteronomy regularly on Sundays. We're of course up to chapter 19, as you can probably well tell from today's reading. To give you a recap for those of us regulars who either weren't here last week or for anyone who's visiting, the first 10 verses of this particular chapter, Deuteronomy 19, is concerning something that we call the cities of refuge. This feature or this function of the ancient Israelite kingdom that God establishes as a part of the judicial system. This part of the book of Deuteronomy is all concerning civic and religious functions. The previous chapters have all been about the establishment of judges and magistrates in the land, the law of the king, how the king was to be chosen, how the king was to rule and govern his people, what a true righteous king is by nature, as well as purpose, so on and so forth, as well as the ecclesiastical functions of the priesthood and the various other elements of the church as well. These cities of refuge are part of those instructions being given for how God has ordered the world and many of the actual principles that govern a good and righteous nation, a Christian nation. Those cities of refuge were created, and this is what we looked at last week specifically, for those in the example given who had committed crimes by accident, essentially. The example that is given, it is not the only one, but it is the example used in those first 10 verses, is of two gentlemen chopping down trees in the wood for lumber. And one is working on the tree, and for whatever fluke of a reason it is, the axe flies out of his hand and hits the other gentleman, and he dies. Okay, this is simply given as an example of an accidental death, what we in our Western, in this case, English law code, rightly call manslaughter, right? Something distinct from murder, the accidental killing of someone. This man was then given the grace, or the mercy, I suppose, in this case, of being able to flee to one of these cities which had been established in the land. They were usually within about a day's journey from wherever people were in and around the surrounding regions, and he was able to flee to that city, which was run by the priests, and to appeal his case and to explain that this was not actually on purpose. The legal terminology that we have in our code called mens rea, the guilty mind. Okay? This was not with malice aforethought, it was not intentional, he had no hatred in his heart, is the words that are used specifically. And there he was to be adjudicated fairly with due process and all the things which you may well be familiar with from the law codes of this country. And if found to have not done this intentionally, right, so it was an accident in that particular case, then he was to remain in essentially an internal exile within the city until the death of the high priest who ruled in those days. Okay, he was not free to return. There was consequences for his actions, but they were not the full weight of what it would be if he had indeed committed murder. This passage that we just had read to us from verses 11 to 13 turn in that secondary direction. In other words, here Moses explains what the case would be for one who does actually do that. The man who lies in wait, in other words, ambushes. It's planned. He has hatred in his heart for the person, and he seeks to, in this case, as we say, murder him. That man will not be given refuge. There will not be mercy shown to that man. What instead will come is the full weight of the law. Justice, true, righteous, and pure, must be administered to that man. For reasons that the Bible explains quite deliberately, as well as very deeply and profoundly. That as we see going all the way back to some of the earliest portions of the book of Genesis, wherein Cain slaughters his own brother Abel, the earth cries out when innocent blood is spilt upon it. This poetic language is used to describe something very, very profound. That there is an injustice that has occurred in the unrighteous killing of another human being, right? Murder. And that there is a essentially cosmic demand in the way that God has created and ordered the world to work, wherein that must be accounted for. The blood of the innocent spilt, the slaughter of those who did not deserve to face such a fate, those which is born of malice and bitterness and envy and strife and all the various vices and sins which mankind is so widely plagued with, it demands justice. There is a reckoning that must come against those, or against the one, in this case of this account or story, who has done this grave evil. This is something which as human beings we feel almost instinctually. If our conscience is active, if our conscience is in right order, when we see grave injustice occur around us even, there is this sense in which something is not right. There is something wrong in the world. We feel this, of course, naturally, the closer and closer that is to home. We feel that for our loved ones most powerfully. We feel it, of course, especially when it is ourselves. When an injustice occurs against the self, the temptation is toward fury and revenge, something which is, of course, warned against by the very same God. That he has established the due processes of justice and the ways, or the means, in other words, by which that must be administered. And that we are not to take revenge for ourselves, but rather to seek God in executing his vengeance. Right? Justice. Those words being used synonymously. The approach, the mentality, the mindset, the outlook by which and with which these ancient people are told to understand these things comes in what is ultimately the form of verse 13. Your eye shall not pity them. You must purge the blood of the innocents from the land, in order that it may go well with you. Now, there's something very particular in the wording here that I want you to be able to see, because it will establish what is the foremost principle that we, some thousands of years later, need to be able to learn and understand from this. Of course, for those who have been with us week by week, learning from this book of Deuteronomy, we have become very well acquainted and familiar with our approach to it. Namely, that whilst there are elements of these ancient law codes that, of course, were specific or particular to those ancient people, the point and purpose is the underlying general principle, what we sometimes call, in terminology, the spirit of the law. You may have heard that distinction between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. The letter of the law being that which is actually written, the spirit of the law being the actual moral and ethical principle, or principles, plural, behind why it is written. The spirit of the law is why it's written. The letter of the law is what is written. And if you are familiar with the Gospels, you will actually be very well aware of this dynamic, perhaps just not in those terms. If you are familiar with the Gospel of Matthew, for example, you will know of Christ saying in the Sermon on the Mount and elsewhere, "You have heard it said, you shall not murder. But I say unto you, he who has hatred toward his brother in his heart has already murdered him." Well, that's directly the very command which is being referenced or addressed in this passage in Deuteronomy 19. He who has hatred in his heart for his brother and then murders him out of jealousy, bitterness, envy, whatever else happens to be. Okay? The spirit of the law, the underlying metaphysical reality behind why the law is what it is, with the letter being the mere what. You shall not do X, or you shall do Y. In that operation, your eye shall not pity them. Now, the eye speaks of something very poetically powerful, in fact. Okay. It is often said rightly, especially in the English language, that the eye is the window to the soul. And this is a concept which many cultures around the world have well understood. The eye is representative of the mind. It is representative of the will. It is representative of knowledge, that which sees, that which gazes out upon the world around it, that which looks and perceives and comes to know and understand thereby. In this example, the eye pitying is the eye looking upon the woeful circumstance of the person who has committed the murder, and the temptation that here is being warned against. To have some sense of misapplied pity, what, to be alliterative, we will call perverted pity. There is a true and rightful application for pity. We see this all throughout the sacred scriptures. Having pity on the poor, upon the oppressed, upon the widowed, all these various things, they are but reflections of God's own divine character, where the Lord himself very clearly not only says, but also does indeed take care of those who are downtrodden, of those who are destitute, of those who are widowed, of all these various characteristics, of the orphaned, of those affected by warfare, so on and so forth. This is not the pity that is being spoken of, what we would genuinely call true pity. This is the kind of pity that is misapplied and misplaced. Why? Because this man, in this example, is a murderer. It is not the community merely believed that he was a murderer. There was not a wildfire of gossip that spread around by mere accusation. Okay? He has fled to the city of refuge. He has presented himself before the court, hoping to manipulate the emotional sentiments of the judges. Because these cities of refuge were only for those who had done something by accident, right? There was no forethought, as we would say, in other words, planning, okay? It wasn't born of hatred or of jealousy or of envy or of any of these other things. It was an accident. There were still consequences for those actions, but they were merciful. No, this is someone who was seeking to, P-R-E-Y, prey upon the emotions of those who were adjudicating. Seeking to make himself the woeful figure who should be pitied. God rejects this. The creator of the cosmos, the very one who has breathed life into our very lungs, the one who formed Adam from the dust of the earth, the one who created Eve from his side, the one who has knit together in that poetic language every single one of us for countless aeons since those days, who has known you, who has understood you, who has cared for you and provided for you ever since you were conceived in your mother's womb. That God, the one and only, says no. You will not pity him. He has shed innocent blood through hatred, through malice, through envy, through insert whatever sin it is, or the combination thereof that begat this, that caused this, that brought this man to do this thing, that caused him to rupture the peace and justice of the world around him. You shall not pity him. Pity is for the innocent. Pity is not for the wicked. This seems harsh. This seems rough. It seems jaded to many of our modern ears. We in a time who value so dearly, for better or worse, our own sense of fairness, of equity, of egalitarianism, see these words, and we may be likewise tempted to pity. We are instructed in the opposite direction. Because the fundamental reality of what is being communicated to us here in these words. You shall not pity him, or your eye literally shall not pity him, right? When you look upon him and what he has done and what he has now become, in this case, for example, a murderer, you shall not pity him. Instead, you shall purge the blood of the innocent. In other words, you shall execute justice to provide justice in all account and balance for what he has done. The reasoning behind that is because at its core, regardless of modern sentimentalities, of modern opinions, of the arbitrary whims and ideals that we loosely or tightly cling to, mercy, in this case or example here to use the term, pity toward the wicked is cruelty toward the innocent. I'll say that again. Pity toward the wicked is cruelty toward the innocent. If, in this example, the judges of this city, the court, the officials, were to pity this man, what does it communicate about the blood, about the life, that is to say, of the man who was murdered? You don't matter. Your one and only life snuffed out by the manifold and manifest evil of this other man, the one life that you have in this world, unjustly snatched from you, oh well. Bad luck. Tough break. We're going to pity this man who continues to live and continues to breathe and continues his existence despite having unjustly taken yours. Pity toward the wicked is cruelty toward the innocent, because it inescapably communicates what I just said. Whether we believe that or not is irrelevant. Your belief, my belief, does not alter the reality of how the world works. When justice is not met, true justice, it communicates that this is the true standard of justice. Leniency against sin, against evil, against crime. Pitying the wrong people. Misplacing genuine pity off of the person whom it should be directed toward and onto someone who is not worthy of it. That is what this is addressing. Your eye shall not pity them. It shows that one does not truly care for the affected party, the person, who in this case, who was murdered. This is why St. Paul the Apostle, in the general principle, says that he who does not take care of his own people, especially those members of his own house, in other words, his family, he is worse than an unbeliever. He's worse than an infidel. Because indeed, if God loves and cares for us as his people, as his family, as his adopted children, which he most certainly does, how can we then not care for our own household in due course and in like fashion? Well, by failing to uphold and to advocate and to defend true justice in our midst, we fail the second of the two great commandments, which is what? Love your neighbour as yourself. Is it loving to allow injustice to be perpetrated against your fellow people, against your neighbours, your countrymen? No. Does pitying those who commit these acts demonstrate that you have a genuine love and affection for the members of your house, of your people? No. In fact, not only does it not do that, it does the opposite. The reason why our natural instinctual inclination toward a sense of anger when injustice occurs against those who are dear to us, the reason why that is baked into our very conscience from God, is because that is the natural affection of how we as people are meant to live and operate in the world. When we feel that sense, things are in right order. If we don't feel that way, what does that then naturally indicate? Something is wrong. This is why the term that we are using here today is perverted pity, right? Pity that has been corrupted, pity that has changed course, pity that has been misapplied. It's taken out of its application, its rightful application, and applied onto someone or something to which it should not be applied. The perversion of pity. Now, so that we might understand the ways in which we avoid this or should avoid this, we must first understand why this happens. Okay? We see all manner of examples of this in our own time. In fact, we see it to such an exorbitant degree that it has become, in all meaningful senses, de facto. Right? It has become the status quo. It has become normalised. It has become normalised in our judicial system. It has become normalised in our political system. It has become normalised in a variety of ways. The simplest search of even just headlines, as little trust as one can usually put in them these days, for crimes such as, for example, rape or sexual assault, will routinely find you sentences of 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. In fact, if the sentence is ever beyond 5 years, I'm usually aghast. I'm shocked. The full-blown rape of women, of children, garnering months in prison, as opposed to what should be happening, death, or in second place, life. For one of the single most grave crimes and sins that a human being can commit, the violation of the innocence of women and of men and of children, boys and girls, whichever direction. And you get a 2-year vacation in a, broadly speaking, well-maintained government facility with 3 square meals a day and televisions and a library and a gym, in an estate that for many of the perpetrators would be better than their own home circumstance. Why does this happen? Well, I can tell you exactly how this happens. For the violation of these very words. If I can give you but one example of this. A few years ago, I believe 2024 was when the ruling came down, there was a very infamous case in Queensland, okay, a very deeply controversial case. In Katoomba, the country town of Katoomba, right, small place, in rural Queensland. In this particular example, a Sudanese migrant had lured and raped a young woman, right, near the side of a road, okay, violently and brutally, beating her and raping her. When this individual was arrested and charged and the court case proceeded, boom, 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 he was admittedly eventually found guilty, which one might go, well, thank goodness. Except in this particular example, the judge found the sentencing very difficult, not because of some niche extenuating circumstance, not because of some new line of evidence. No, because in the judge's words, and this is a direct quotation, this is a difficult sentencing. On the one hand, we have this fine, upstanding young man with a bright future ahead of him. On the other hand, we have a traumatized young woman whose life has been changed. That man was sentenced to 5 years with a 2-year suspended sentence. In other words, he will serve 2 years in prison and then be released. Because, in the judge's mind, This was a really tough decision. Because as we know well, that anyone who rapes a woman is by definition a bright and upstanding young man. That's sarcasm for anyone who cannot tell in the inflection in my voice. The humour of sarcasm aside, you must understand why that happened. In this particular example, there were two factors that drew this particular sentence. A kind of sentence and a kind of rationale that has become all too common in the states of Australia, particularly in places like Victoria. Okay. In this case, the woman who was the judge was also herself a refugee. In her case from Bosnia, so Eastern Europe, former Yugoslavia. As a refugee, she saw the perpetrator as but another victim of circumstance in life, as himself being a refugee from the Sudan. Her natural, quote-unquote, affections was to pity him. It should be pretty obvious what's going on there. The perverted pity, by virtue of her own circumstance, directly impacting the sentencing, to the point where in this utterly irrational twilight zone of a scenario, you can have a sitting judge refer to a man who beats and rapes a woman as a fine, upstanding young man with a bright future ahead of him. That is precisely what we are talking about. More importantly, that is precisely what God Almighty is talking about here. Your eye shall not pity him. You could be a Nobel Prize winning nuclear physicist. You could be the most famous athlete in the world. You could be the second coming of Mother Teresa, for all I care. You beat and rape a woman, you die. That is the just penalty. It does not matter how bad your childhood was. There is no amount of hungry nights in your life over in South Sudan that just compels you to lure and beat and rape a woman. Do you understand? There is no amount of poverty which just forces you against your will to brutally and violently violate a woman or anyone. There is nothing that can occur in your life that just compels you. It doesn't matter. None of it matters. Because that young 20-something-year-old Australian girl can never be unraped. She can never be untraumatized. She can never be unbrutalized. Her life, tragically for her, becomes marked by the time before that happened and the time after that happened. The only thing which can even dream of resolving that trauma for that young woman is the grace and mercy of God. That is it. Her life is changed in ways that we as human beings cannot fix within ourselves. But thank God that that bright young man will be able to have his bright future in 24 months once he's released. In fact, actually by now, he would be coming pretty close to the end of his sentence. He would be out probably by next year. to go back into the community and live the rest of his life. This is one of an infinite list of examples. Because what has now taken over our people, what has now taken over our country, to be more specific, is this perverted sense of pity, where we look at the circumstance and we look at the alleged woes, real or not, of those who commit horrific crimes, those who are repeat offenders, those who have a what we call high recidivism rate. In other words, they keep committing crimes. They go to prison, get released, commit more crimes, end up back in prison. Over and over and over again. Our justice system has become a never-ending, perpetual conveyor belt of the same people. The actual amount of people, just in terms of sheer volume, who are committing crimes is not really much higher than what it was, say, a decade ago. But the crime rates, in other words, how often crimes are happening, through the roof. That's certainly the case in examples like the Victorian juvenile system. Same amount of children in detention, right? Teenagers, 15, 16, 17, whatever. But the crime rate has quadrupled in certain areas. We're pitying things that should not be pitied. We are looking at these things with a sense of heartfelt care, and all we are doing is actually corrupting the justice for the innocents. Now, we might look at this as Christians, for those of us who are Christians, and look at this and go, well, okay, so if someone is not of Christian background, if they are not actually rooted in the morality and the ethics of the faith, if they are anchorless in that particular regard, right, as so many people unfortunately are now today, well, then that can explain why that's going on, right? And in a sense it does, right, to a degree. It does. When you have no true virtue of yourself, when you actually have no genuine moral framework that comes from outside of you, that comes from an objective authority like God, you make up morality for yourself. You tailor your particular ethics and your moral framework toward whatever is expedient for you, in other words, beneficial for you socially. Instead of actually having true virtue that you live out, you instead signal your virtue toward other people. Oh, look at how good a person I am. Oh, look at me doing this thing over here. Oh, look at me doing that thing over there. Just like the Pharisees did, for example, in the Gospels. Right? The classic parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector, okay? This religious figure who stood very publicly on the corner, who prayed a little bit more loudly than room volume so that people could hear him pray his illustrious, highfalutin prayers. Meanwhile, there's this other gentleman, a tax collector, so someone who was seen as a traitor by the Jews to the Romans, right? And he's on his knees, in tears. We're told he's beating his chest, right, in anguish, and all he can cry out is, "Lord, have mercy upon me, a sinner." Right? One has true virtue, the man who realizes he is broken in spirit, the man who realizes that he is guilty before God, the man who realizes that, like us all, we have sinned against the Almighty and that we need his grace and forgiveness, right? In other words, the queen of the virtues, humility. The other man, he has nothing but pride. He has to signal his virtue, supposedly, to other people. He has no true virtue of himself. He has to signal, like the spiritual peacock that he is, to everyone else around him. That's why people do this. When you have no true virtue, when you have no true moral framework that comes from an objective higher authority, namely God, you have to fill that void, that emptiness, that vacuum with made-up virtue, with counterfeit virtue, false piety, for social credit, so that you can be seen to be virtuous without actually being virtuous. The example of that case I referenced from Katoomba was well received by many different people. It was well received by law review groups. It was well received by sentencing advocacy organisations, by non-government organisations, charities, things like this, whose entire existence and grift and industry is geared and built toward reducing sentences for crimes, for reforming people through in prisons, for having all manner of programs to help these people, all these kinds of things. Which is, of course, one of the defining reasons as to why that woman did that. Because there is this propensity for people, and particularly those with the motherly instinct, to pervert that pity, the natural affections that otherwise go toward our children and our loved ones, instead being misplaced on those who are not our children, who are not loved ones, and who are not worthy of being either. All of this is why the Israelites in Deuteronomy 19 were told that you shall not pity them. Instead, you shall purge the blood of the innocent from the land. Because that blood, in this poetic language, cries out for justice. It demands justice, and there is an inequity. There is a languishing evil in the world when that blood goes unanswered. It's like a silent beacon beaming out, so to speak, yet never being received or seen. There's so many ways that we could talk about that in the ways in which this happens. So many countless ways. We have this baked into our own society through something which, of course, we've referenced during our time here in Deuteronomy. Things at its most grievous levels, like the abortion industry, where we have the wholesale slaughter of the innocents, exactly this same paradigm, that is perpetuated through nothing but perverted pity. The proclamation of God is clear. The morality of this is abundantly settled. We know, not just merely theologically, but we know scientifically, that our life begins when we are conceived. This is a human being. This is not up for debate. There is no discussion to be had. We would be equally well served discussing whether 1 + 1 = 2, whether water is wet, or whether the sun rises in the east. In other words, utterly undisputed things. When that life is taken, early, middling, late, it matters not. The shedding of innocent blood is entirely driven by what? Pity. Well, think about the circumstance of the parents, or usually it's not even the parents. Think about the circumstance of the mother. As if someone in my position doesn't deal with and help mothers in need. As if someone like me hasn't actually done this work. As if we as Christians aren't the ones who have built the majority of the world's charities, the majority of the world's schools, the majority of the world's financial institutions in terms of aiding people, of infrastructure. As if we don't know what care and compassion looks like. As if we aren't the words from whom the very word charity even comes, right? Caritas, the Greek word for grace. It's our word. Well, I'm at university. I'm not ready for a kid yet. But you are ready to do the thing that results in having kids. The one thing, the only thing that results in having children. You were ready for that, but you weren't ready for the outcome of that? That doesn't make sense. I'm in my new job. I'm on the career progression. So because you have dreams, your child should die? Again, where does that morally make sense? I'm poor and destitute. And that's very sad. A, let us help you. B, we have a line down the street and round the corner of people who are not only willing but able to adopt your child. Right? In many respects and in many circumstances, there are more people waiting to adopt children than there are children. Your child can have that circumstance. There's no shame in putting your child up for adoption. There is none. There's no need to feel that shame. Life happens. We are all victims of various different things, usually by our own hand, and sometimes from things around us. But there are alternatives. There are options that have always been there. But no, we default to murder babies. Even in the most emotionally charged of circumstances, a mother being raped, right? Or a woman in this case being raped, becoming a mother, right? Conceiving. As emotionally driven and charged as that example is, I will give you the words of the woman who was in that exact circumstance, who I helped make the right decision. She would tell you, as she now holds her, 7-year-old little girl, that there is no reason as to why my child should die for the sins of her father. Because after all, we live in a country where rapists get a couple of years in prison. We give death sentences to children of rape through the allowance of abortion, and yet we only send their fathers to prison for a couple of months because of pity. All of this comes down to perverted pity. And I'm not here pretending, by the way, let me be very clear. I'm not here pretending that these issues are not, as I just referenced earlier, emotionally laden. Right? I'm not pretending that there isn't deep, strongly held, emotional, sentimental things attached to these concepts and these ideas. Not only am I not pretending that's not the case, I'm actually going the opposite direction in highlighting to you that the words given to you, commanded to you, decreed unto you by God Almighty is not, your eyes shall not pity them unless you feel really bad for them. Your eyes shall not pity them unless you arbitrarily decide that you have a soft spot for them. Your eyes shall not pity them unless they meet one of these handful of circumstances in which you get to virtue signal about how kind you are, quote unquote, to people. No. Your eye shall not pity them. Because the things that are happening are evil. They are evil. They are wicked. They are dark. They are horrific. We're not talking about summary executions for 9-year-old children that happen to nick a bag of chips at the service station. It should be obvious. I shouldn't even have to highlight that. We are talking about theft, assault, rape, murder. We're talking about all manner of things, not limited to, but like that. Serious, horrific evils that are occurring because, and this is Christians, you must see and understand, pay attention here. The ultimate reason that undergirds that perverted pity is a word that we hardly use today. Ironically, because we are actually the very thing that would stop us from using the term. Cowardice. Cowardice. Moral ethical, spiritual cowardice. The inability to look at these just replete circumstances that have become now the new normal in our society and amongst our people. The inability to actually identify that as a grave problem, the kind of problem that when combined with anything else is, in no uncertain terms, the death sentence of a society and of a civilization. The inability to stand firm in the face of that, to actually say, no, that's wrong, that shouldn't be happening. The inability to actually defend and protect and advocate for righteousness and justice ultimately comes down to one's own cowardice. It's fear. It is fear of social pressure. It's fear of social norms. It's fear of being thought of as wrong or as a bad person or whatever the zeitgeist of the age happens to dictate, whatever the actual social morality of the time in which you live happens to convey. Well, without being smart, if the social morality of a people is giving utter slaps on the wrist to serious, violent crimes, and if you are a bad person, quote unquote, if you are not with the times, if you are not on the right side of history for advocating the full administration of justice toward those people, that's not a society worth having. Do you understand? And not only, again, this is not me saying this. Forget me. What does verse 13 say? Look at what's in front of you if you have it open. Your eye shall not pity him. You must purge the blood of the innocents from the land in order that it may go well for you. We've encountered that phrase before for those of us who are here regularly. What does that mean? I'll remind you. When he says in order that it may go well, what is God talking about? He is saying, again, what we've covered before, what he is saying is, here is how the world has been ordered. Here is what is good and true and beautiful and right. If you, as people, live in accordance with this way, things will work. Right? We know this. Okay? Your car has been designed a particular way. It's been manufactured a certain way. It's been created. I designed a particular way to work. Right? If you're driving down the road and you're in X whatever gear and you then just decide to slam it in reverse, your car's not going to have a good time. Because it's not designed to be travelling 100 kilometres an hour down the highway to then just immediately get shifted into reverse. Yeah? Your gearbox is not designed for that. Transmission's not designed for that. None of your car is designed for that. Okay? So what goes happen to your car? Kapoof. That's what happens to your car. Right? Insert whatever example you want. Right? We know this. The way the thing is designed dictates how it is to operate. The world is no different. The world has been designed by an infinite, omnipotent, omnibenevolent God. All-knowing, all-powerful, all-good. The God who is in himself truth and righteousness and love and mercy and grace and justice and 1,000 other things beside. When we do not operate, when we do not live our lives individually or collectively in accordance with his way, will it go well or will it go poorly? Well, what he's saying is it will go poorly. We may get rich, we may get powerful, we may do any manner of things that come from, as we say, ill-gotten gain. But how long will that last? Well, do we not find ourselves in that circumstance all the very same in the modern world? How wealthy, how rich, how powerful we have become in the Western world. yet we have lost any meaningful sense of justice. We have not one sliver of a concept like truth. We are utter slaves to our instincts and our vices. We consume without building. We deliberate as opposed to define. We act on arbitrary opinions, grounded and rooted in nothing but the thin and vacuous air of our own emotions and opinions. In the case here, we have become a people enslaved to false pity, to an utterly false sense of piety that is born off of looking good, looking moral, looking virtuous to people around us without actually being good, moral, or virtuous within. As Christians, we must be the most on guard against this very reality. Because the temptation that plagues you as a Christian is this: things around you in society seeming being the operative word, to be moral, seeming to be virtuous, plucking on the heartstrings of your Christian ethic and conscience to lull you into conformity to this false sense of piety. Well, just think about the circumstance of this person. Look at their background. Oh, they were poor, they did this, they grew up in public housing, they had a tough time at school, they had a da-da-da-da-da. Whatever you want. All of these things. I'll think about, in the case of the Sudanese gentleman, think about this guy, he's a refugee, he's had a tough life in Africa, he's had this and that, all the hardship coming over, he got bullied at school. He raped a woman. Your pity is cruelty. Your false piety is a translucent, paper-thin veneer for your utter lack of virtue and morality. These people would not know justice if it lopped their own head off, which ironically happens to be the just punishment that they should be facing. Because perhaps the only worse thing than the murderer in this example of Deuteronomy 19 is the judge who would otherwise let him off, is the people who would stand around pitying him and not the man, the woman, the child, whatever it is, whose life has just been snuffed out from the cosmos. Abandon this false sense of piety. Do not walk into the trap, as a Christian, of this facade of morality and virtue, for it is none of those things. It desperately attempts to propagandize you, to indoctrinate you, to sway your emotions into believing that this is what is good and virtuous. It shines with the bright veneer of gold, but upon closer examination is nothing but gilded flakes that sit atop an utterly dead and rotted corpse. As Christians, we must not pity evil. Our toleration of these things, has it made the lives of our people better, or has it made it worse in the years and the decades that have gone by, in your own lifetime? Are we better off now than we were 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago? We are certainly not. We are absolutely not. We are indisputably not. Much of this responsibility falls on my own peers. It falls on my fellow clergymen, ballless, spineless, gutless, who are the very same cowards who God condemns. The very same cowards whom God says in Revelation 21 will not inherit the kingdom of God. To such a powerful degree that he lists cowards before he lists liars and murderers and sexual assaulters and deviants. Cowards will not enter the kingdom of heaven. If you are a coward, you will not inherit the kingdom of heaven. God hates cowards. God can forgive cowards. God does forgive cowards. God has grace and mercy in store for cowards if they humble themselves and repent, just as we all should. But if you do not, your cowardice will not reward you. It may protect you in this life from social stigma, from embarrassment, from self-centered shame, but it will not protect you from the judgment of the Almighty. Instead, what as Christians are we called to do? And I'll leave you with this. What are we continually told? In fact, what is the single most repeated phrase throughout the entirety of the Holy Bible? Do not fear. And its positive equivalent, be strong and courageous. Which is why those two phrases often find themselves together. Be strong and courageous, do not fear. Are we to fear our fellow man and the opinions and whims and judgments of that? Or are we to fear God? Well, the answer is the latter. We are to uphold and obey God's justice and God's truth. That is what we are to do, not the false piety of our fellow man. If we as Christians actually become the ones who take a genuine and true and humble and righteous stand for justice, for righteousness, not the rubbish definition of that exists in our society. I'm talking about actual justice, actual truth, not defined by arbitrary opinions of people, but by God. If we do that, we will start to have a society again. We actually might have a country worth saving. Because at this stage we don't. So it begins within you, begins within us, begins in your own personal life, it begins in your family, it begins in your own community like the one you're in here now. That's where it begins. Because you now become the guardians, the protectors, the translators, right, to future generations of truth and goodness and righteousness and justice, while the world around you perverts it and corrupts it through false piety and false morality. Do not pity evil. Stand up against evil and vanquish it. In the name of the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Amen.